$37,000. That's all it took. $37,000 to send XRP from under $1 to $50 on a live exchange in a single trade in real time. And while most people looked at that moment and said glitch, a small group of analysts looked at the exact same event and said something completely different. They said, "This is a preview. Stay with me, because what that moment actually revealed about XRP's future is something the mainstream crypto media has almost entirely missed." Let's go. August 2023. XRP gets relisted on Gemini after a period of regulatory uncertainty. The order book reopens, but it reopens nearly empty. Razor-thin liquidity. Almost no sell-side depth. Just a hollow book with scattered sell orders and one rogue order sitting at exactly $50. Then a market buy comes in. It doesn't just fill, it tears through every available sell order in sequence, sweeping the entire book until it hits that $50 order and executes. Total volume moved? Roughly $37,000, less than the cost of a mid-range luxury car. And it sent XRP to $50 a coin on a live, regulated exchange. Now, was this proof that XRP is headed to $50? No, this was a thin order book event. A liquidity anomaly caused by a freshly relisted asset with almost no market depth. Technically, it was a glitch in the sense that no normal, healthy market behaves this way. But here's what it did reveal, and this is the part worth paying attention to. It gave us a real-world, live demonstration of what happens when even a tiny amount of demand hits a market with insufficient liquidity. And it handed a group of sharp, institutional analysts a very uncomfortable theoretical question. If $37,000 can do that on a thin retail order book, what happens when a Tier 1 bank attempts a multi-billion-dollar cross-border settlement through a market that isn't deep enough to absorb it? The answer, in theory, is not just slippage. It's systemic breakdown. The transaction destabilizes. The price becomes uncontrollable. The transfer fails at an institutional scale. And this is the foundation of what analyst Chiron Cherasan XRP has been building an entire institutional thesis around. And it's one of the more compelling frameworks circulating in the XRP community right now. Here is the core of that theory. For XRP to function as a genuine global institutional liquidity bridge at scale, banks cannot simply plug into on-demand liquidity as passive users and source XRP on the open market in real time during peak transaction windows. If institutions are moving billions, potentially trillions, through XRP simultaneously, the open market cannot absorb that demand without the kind of catastrophic slippage the Gemini candle hinted at. The logical solution, this theory argues, is that banks must hold pre-funded, deeply locked XRP reserves in their own isolated liquidity pools, under their own management, before large transactions are ever initiated. And now think about what that means structurally. You are no longer talking about retail speculation or hype cycles driving XRP's price. You are talking about thousands of financial institutions simultaneously pulling XRP off the open market to pre-fund their own internal reserves. Hundreds of millions of XRP locked in transit between institutional wallets at any given moment. Available floating supply on open exchanges shrinks dramatically. And as supply contracts against institutional demand that is continuous and non-negotiable, you get a supply shock unlike anything this market has experienced. Now, when it comes to price, here is where the community theory gets particularly interesting and where I want to be precise with you. Analysts like Chiron Cherasan argue that if XRP's unit price stays at $10 or $20, the total depth of the liquidity pool remains shallow relative to what global institutional volume would demand. The theory holds that a higher unit price per XRP means a deeper pool, meaning the same number of tokens can absorb far larger transaction volumes without moving the market destructively. Under this framework, prices of 300, 500, or even beyond are not predictions rooted in hype. They are the projected outcome of what a genuine institutional supply shock, combined with mass adoption of XRP as a liquidity bridge, would mathematically produce. Now, is this a guaranteed outcome? No. Critics of this theory correctly point out that XRP's velocity, the speed at which a single token can complete a transaction and return to the market, means the effective liquidity is higher than the static supply suggests. The debate is real and ongoing among serious analysts. But what makes this theory powerful is not that it ignores those arguments, it's that it says institutional pool locking fundamentally changes the velocity equation. If banks are holding XRP in dedicated reserves rather than cycling it through rapid transactions, velocity arguments weaken considerably. This is not financial advice. This is a framework, one of the most serious analytical frameworks in the XRP community, and it deserves to be understood properly. Now let's look at the regulatory and macro environment, because the backdrop to all of this has shifted dramatically. For years, XRP operated under a legal cloud that no other major digital asset faced. A multi-year SEC lawsuit that created institutional paralysis. Nobody at the bank level was going to build infrastructure around an asset that the US government was actively litigating. That era is over. The legal battle is resolved. Ripple has more regulatory clarity today than virtually any other digital asset project in the United States. And as that clarity has taken hold, not through a single announcement, but through a sustained series of legal victories, regulatory shifts, and policy evolution, something has changed at the institutional level. The institutions are moving, not publicly, not loudly, but the infrastructure activity tells the story. And the broader regulatory environment in Washington has shifted fundamentally in favor of digital asset integration into the traditional financial system. The question for banks and custodians is no longer whether to build, it's how fast. And this is why the Chiron thesis argues that markets price in the future, not the calendar. Institutions do not wait for legislation to be fully codified before accumulating and building. They move at the moment legal risk drops below their threshold. They move when the regulatory fog lifts enough to justify infrastructure investment. And by that logic, the accumulation phase does not begin at some future date, it begins now. Speaking of infrastructure, let's talk about what is already built, because this is the part that matters most. The DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, currently holds over $110 trillion in securities. $110 trillion. This is the backbone of American financial markets, and they are now publicly telling every financial institution in the world that the path to tokenization runs through them, and that firms that want to participate need to take action right now, not in a year, not when legislation fully finalizes, right now. Their goal is extraordinary in its ambition: tokenize all $100 trillion in assets on their books. They are starting with Russell 1000 ETFs, treasuries, and fixed income instruments, but the roadmap goes far beyond that. And they made one point with unusual emphasis during their recent communication to the industry: liquidity must not be fragmented. When you disaggregate assets, you disaggregate liquidity. When you disaggregate liquidity, you destroy price discovery. And that hurts every participant, retail and institutional alike. Their collateral mobility platform is being designed to let clients exchange collateral at the speed of the blockchain network, not the 2 to 3 day settlement cycles of legacy infrastructure. The speed delta alone represents a revolution in how capital efficiency works at the institutional level. And then there's Finastra, a direct Ripple partner, who described the operational reality in language that deserves to be heard clearly. The connectivity is already in place. The messaging infrastructure is already in place. For any bank or credit union that joins the network, payments begin flowing immediately upon activation. The system isn't being built, it is built. And when the corridors are ready to go live at scale, the phrase they used was simple and surgical: you flip a switch. The switch exists. The infrastructure behind it is live. Now let's address something that the XRP community has debated for years: the price suppression theory. At XRP Las Vegas, a speaker raised a question that still echoes. In 2017 and 2018, XRP hit over $3 with virtually no real-world banking integration and no regulatory clarity. Today, with hundreds of verified banking partnerships, a resolved lawsuit, global payment infrastructure spanning dozens of countries, and DTCC involvement, the price has spent years trading below those 2018 peaks. How? Why? The theory that has gained serious traction is not one of malicious actors pulling strings in a dark room. It's more nuanced than that. The argument is strategic sequencing. You cannot activate global institutional corridors before the infrastructure is complete. You cannot onboard sovereign-level financial institutions before regulatory clarity exists. You cannot unlock a liquidity mechanism before the pools are deep enough to handle institutional volume. The escrow schedule is strategic. The corridor build-out is strategic. dynamic. The CBDC development running in parallel across multiple nations is strategic. Everything has been sequenced toward a specific moment of readiness. And if strategic patience governed the build-out phase, the institutional math and the infrastructure reality suggest the activation phase may be closer than the price currently reflects. Now zoom out to the macro picture, because there is a broader market dynamic playing out that provides important context. Raoul Pal, one of the most respected macro voices in this space, made a structural observation about Bitcoin recently that is worth sitting with. Bitcoin, he argues, operates under a power law curve, a logarithmic growth channel that decelerates as network maturity increases. The reason is straightforward. Bitcoin is competing for one thing, a share of global savings. That is its total addressable market, and by definition, it has a ceiling. Compare that to programmable Layer 1 networks competing for everything that organizes itself digitally: finance, contracts, trade, governance, identity. When you layer artificial intelligence agents on top of that, the total addressable market becomes functionally limitless. And XRP occupies a category that none of the heavily VC-backed Layer 1 networks can honestly claim. It was not pre-allocated to venture capital firms at launch. Ethereum obscured its early whale distribution. Solana, SUI, and virtually every major altcoin gave preferential institutional allocations to the same VC players who now appear on financial media to promote those assets. XRP had no such arrangement. Those same voices have zero financial incentive to champion it, which explains, almost entirely, why you rarely hear them mention it. But the data does not lie. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and XRP are the only three digital assets, excluding stablecoins, that have remained in the CoinMarketCap top 10 every single year since their first year of creation. Every single year. Through multiple bear markets, through the worst crypto winter in a decade, through an SEC lawsuit that would have dismantled any lesser project, XRP never left the top 10. Not once. Not even close. That is not the statistical fingerprint of a speculative pump and dump. That is the fingerprint of foundational, systemic infrastructure that the market keeps returning to, regardless of narrative, regardless of price cycle, regardless of who is or isn't talking about it on YouTube. So here's where everything converges. The Gemini candle gave us a glimpse, a real, live demonstration of what thin liquidity looks like under demand pressure. The institutional liquidity theory built on that event argues that banks will need to pre-fund deep XRP reserves to avoid that scenario at scale. Pre-funding at institutional scale creates a supply shock. A supply shock combined with sustained institutional demand is what the community's leading analysts believe drives the price to levels that make the pool deep enough for global financial volume. The legal overhang is gone. The DTCC is building. Finastra is ready to flip the switch. The regulatory environment has fundamentally shifted. And an asset that has never once left the global top 10, through every storm this market has thrown at it, is sitting at the intersection of all of it. This is not a crypto story anymore. This is a global financial infrastructure story. And XRP, by design, by architecture, and by a decade of deliberate positioning, sits at the center of the liquidity layer that makes it run. The institutions are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for the calendar. They are building right now, quietly, methodically, and at a pace that the open market has not yet fully priced in. Not financial advice. Do your own research. But understand the framework, because the people who understand it earliest tend to be the ones who are ready when the switch gets flipped.